the presentation here, and I'm gonna share my screen. So hopefully you will all see a picture of Dr. Fanduiz there. If I get a thumbs up that it looks good, that'd be great. Perfect. Let me just get it into start. And there we go. And I'm just going to move my box down so I can make sure I see everything. So great. Thanks for all the thumbs up. I appreciate that, especially since everyone's muted and I can't hear your comments. But thank you all again for joining us this evening. As Larissa said, this program was supposed to happen in February, and I think it actually was a saving grace that it didn't, because I was able to use this time, especially as we are now working from home, to devote a great deal of my own time to further research for this presentation and for our general knowledge of Dr. Fanduiz. So as Larissa had mentioned, the program inspiration came to us earlier this fall when I was contacted by descendants of Dr. Fanduiz, who had actually found 2 photographs of Dr. Fanduiz online, including this one right here that you can see on the screen. We had uploaded those years ago to Maine Memory Network, a wonderful project that is sponsored by the Maine Historical Society that allows smaller institutions like ourselves to be able to put some of our collections up online. And so I was familiar with the 2 photographs that Angela had pointed me and referenced to me, but I didn't actually really know a ton about Dr. Fanduiz himself. He is a bit of a mystery to me. I knew he existed, but didn't really know what he had done or really anything about his career. So that really spurred a large and what has turned out to be months-long research project into trying to figure out who was this individual, what did he do, and what was his life like. So we'll go to the next slide here. And so Salustiano Fanduiz was born on June 8th, 1868 in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. His parents were Constantino and Maria Valentina, and both were of Afro-Caribbean descent, and actually were originally from the Dutch colony of Aruba, so an island significantly south from the Dominican Republic. Fanduiz was born only 3 years after the War of Restoration, which led to the second iteration of a democratic state for the Dominican Republic. Prior to this conflict, the DR had been under Spanish rule, which had followed a short-lived first attempt by the DR to hold a republican government. And however, even though the government was in this new iteration as a democracy, there continued to be a great deal of political strife and upheaval in the country that unfortunately would follow Fanduiz throughout his life. And we're going to discuss that a little bit later. But just keep that in the back of your mind as you're thinking about the circumstances that Fanduiz came from, and then also the country that he comes back to later in life. And you'll see here with the red arrow, I've got it pointed to Santo Domingo here, which is the capital of the Dominican Republic. On January 28, 1890, Fanduiz graduated with a bachelor's in science and letters from the Santo Domingo Professional Institute. After graduating, Fanduiz worked as a bookkeeper to support himself. And it's noted in a Bowdoin Orient article, which is Bowdoin College's student newspaper that has been running for many, many years, that Fanduiz desired to learn English even from a young age. And to do so, he relied heavily on a copy of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's poetry to do so. As a result of reading this poetry, Fanduiz had dreamed, it says that he had dreamed of visiting Maine and visiting Brunswick and ultimately Bowdoin College, which was Longfellow's alma mater. And lucky enough for Fanduiz, those dreams actually began to materialize when Fanduiz met his new neighbor, Samuel F. Purrington, who was from Brunswick not too long after he graduated from the Professional Institute. Purrington, the individual from Brunswick, was a deep sea diver, and he had moved to the Dominican Republic with his family in 1889 to guide dredging operations in harbors along the country's south coast. Apparently, Purrington and Fanduiz became very good friends and hit it off essentially right from the beginning when they became neighbors, because the Orient article that I mentioned earlier says, quote, Purrington, finding him, Fanduiz, keen and ambitious, told him much of Maine and more of Brunswick, its colleges, and its opportunities. And so it must not have taken too long for Fanduiz to realize that there was something that he not only could do, but could strive for in Brunswick and at Bowdoin. So he actually applies and ends up matriculating into the Medical School of Maine only a couple years later in 1891. And so the image on your screen that you see here is actually the matriculation document and or application. It's not quite certain what exactly it is, but it essentially has all the biographical info that the Medical School of Maine would need for Fanduiz to admit him and for him to become a student. So you can see his name, his date of birth, and where he was born, his parents' name, as well as the institution that he had received his bachelor's degree from. You'll also note that it says his residence and post office address is then becomes Brunswick, Maine. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. So just as kind of a quick overview, I wanted to give a little quick history of the Medical School of Maine so everyone has an idea of what the institution was and what it was like during Fanduiz's time there, because it's a really unique institution, particularly in its relationship to Bowdoin College. So the Medical School of Maine was established on June 27th, 1820 by the first ever legislature in the newly minted state of Maine. So of course, Maine becomes a state in the Union in 1820, and one of course, the first deeds that the new legislature takes up is to create a medical institution for learning here in the state. What the state did was give control of this new medical school to the trustees and overseers of Bowdoin College. So that's how it got connected. Bowdoin was the oldest institution or higher education institution in the state, having been created in 1794. Bowdoin was granted $1,500 from the state to start this medical school. So that was all they got for their upfront startup costs. And then the state agreed to give the school an additional $1,000 every year to help cover expenses. Of course, we could never run a medical school with $1,000 today, but in 1820, it was a little bit different. Interestingly enough, no degree was required to come into the medical school. So you did not necessarily have to have any training whatsoever to be admitted. Rather, you can see on your screen, the Medical School of Maine's catalog notes that, quote, candidates for matriculation will be required to give evidence that they possess a good English education, including a knowledge of English composition, natural philosophy, and mathematics. Those who are graduates of colleges, normal schools, high schools, or have passed the entrance examination to any recognized college on presentation of their diplomas or matriculation tickets will be exempt from examination. So if you didn't have any of that background, there was some sort of testing that was required for you to be admitted into the school. But needless to say, the requirements for attending medical school back then were significantly different than they are today. And overwhelmingly, the students that attended the Medical School of Maine were from the state of Maine. Few came from out of state, and obviously even fewer came from internationally. Most of the medical school students were direct graduates from Bowdoin College, so they had gotten a bachelor's from Bowdoin and then moved on and decided to get a medical degree, but others came having different undergraduate experiences as well. So the first lecture for the medical school was given in the spring of 1821 in Massachusetts Hall, the first building constructed on Bowdoin's campus, by Dr. Nathan Smith. Dr. Nathan Smith was tasked with kind of beginning the medical school and getting it up and running, and he had a very favorable reputation, seeing as he was the founder of the Dartmouth Medical School, and in the 1820s was also a professor at Yale. So he had some clout behind him, and at least from the state of Maine's perspective, they were getting the medical school off on a relatively strong footing. Eventually, the medical school does get their own building on campus. This is a photograph of Adams Hall. Adams Hall was built in 1862 and became the sole building for the medical school. There were some lab components that were done outside of it, but most of the lectures or anything happening with medical school was in this building. This building still exists on campus today. Classes are still held in it. But what is interesting to note is you can see here the road that is on to the right of the building. That road no longer exists in that position. It actually moved to the other side of the building. And that is what we call Bath Road here in Brunswick now today. So initially, Adams Hall was kind of separated from the campus and divided by that road, but now it's much more an integral part of the campus. And like I said, still in operation today. And believe it or not, they actually renovated this building a few years back. And in order to keep some of the history of the building, there is still a cadaver hook on the ceiling on the 4th floor of the building, in reference to the history of the medical school being in that building. So you actually can walk right into the front doors, look all the way up the stairwell, and see that cadaver hook. So according to John Cross, who I will mention a number of times in this presentation, who is Bowdoin's unofficial historian, if there is any sort of question about Bowdoin's history, you go to this man, because he is a walking encyclopedia, and I don't know what we would do without him. But according to John, enrollment at the medical school in the 19th century was controlled by the medical faculty, which was separate from the academic faculty. So that is another way that the medical school and Bowdoin College were separated. They really were treated as two different institutions. They just happened to share the same space in the same town. Students received written permission to attend a series of lectures on medical topics spread out over 2.5 month terms in the spring semester. That's it. That's the only education that you would be receiving in order to earn your medical degree. Again, very, very different from what is expected of a med school student today. Students would also participate in clinical training. So they did have some person-to-person, or at least cadaver experience. So they knew how to work with a human body. And candidates who were hoping to graduate were tested at least twice each week. So they didn't get off too easy. I don't want you to think that. And they actually had to pass written and oral examinations in all of those subjects that you see on the slide. So there was some academic prowess to this institution. You couldn't graduate without knowing at least some of your stuff. Was it everything a doctor needed to know? Maybe, maybe not, but at least you had a good footing. Also, to graduate, a student had to write a thesis or a dissertation and present that thesis or dissertation to the medical faculty. So you can also see here on the slide, these are the textbooks that are listed in the, or are required for the matriculating class of 1892. And you can see the different types of subjects that they were studying, and kind of just the different titles for books, some of which jump out a little bit more than others, such as Diseases of Women, and the vast nature that topic could possibly bring. We'll move on to the next slide here. And here we can see documentation of Fanduiz matriculating into the Medical School of Maine in 1891. So you can see here I've bolded his section on the catalog, where it states his name, the fact that he does have a degree, an AB, he has a bachelor's, the hometown that he is from, which they write San Domingo, West Indies, the WI standing for that, rather than saying the Dominican Republic. And then this A. Mitchell, which we'll get back to in just a second. I want to point your attention to this fantastic photograph that is courteous of the Bowdoin College Special Collection and Archives. This was probably taken around 1891, 1892 when he came to Brunswick, and it was taken by A.O. Reed, a prominent photographer who had a studio right in downtown Brunswick, which is great. So we know where the photograph was taken, don't know quite the date, but we can sort of get a guess onto that. From the research that I've done, I've been able to figure out that Fanduiz lived with Samuel Purrington, his friend that he made back in the DR, while he was a student at the medical school. And that's also, thankfully, supported by the fact that Marguerite, the daughter of Samuel Purrington, who was actually born in the DR while he was working there, recounts in a letter many, many years later that she remembers Fanduiz living with them while he was a student, which is fantastic to know as well. I also want to note that Fanduiz was not the first individual of color to matriculate and graduate from the Medical School of Maine. Bowdoin had actually awarded 2 MD degrees in 1849 to 2 African-American individuals named John Van Surrey DeGrasse and Thomas Joyner White. John Cross, who I mentioned earlier, wrote a fantastic article about them and their connection to another famous Bowdoin grad, John Brown Russworm, and I'm happy to drop that link in the comments after the presentation if anyone's interested in that. But from what I can gather, for sure, Fanduiz appears to be the only Afro-Caribbean individual to attend the medical school of Maine. So back to this A. Mitchell that you see at the very right-hand corner of the page here in this red box. Alfred Mitchell was Fanduiz's preceptor. And a preceptor for the Medical School of Maine essentially meant that Dr. Mitchell was the mentor for Fanduiz and also would provide some clinical training to him and some supervision over some of the training that he may have been a part of. Dr. Mitchell was incredibly well known in the Brunswick community. He was a very well respected doctor and was considered one of the most prominent medical professionals in the entire state of Maine. He himself had graduated from Bowdoin College and then gone on to New York City to obtain his medical degree. He was a lecturer, a professor, and also the dean of the Medical School of Maine for numerous years, including while Fanduiz is there. And of particular note as well, he was actually the president of the Maine Medical Association while he was the mentor to Fanduiz. So essentially being kind of the head figure of the Maine medical profession, which is very cool. The fact that that Fanduiz had the chance to study and work under Dr. Mitchell had to have been an incredible experience for him, knowing the reputation that Dr. Mitchell had in Brunswick, but also knowing that the respect that Dr. Mitchell garnered from citizens of Brunswick. So the fact that Fanduiz was able to work under him and train under him meant that he already was stepping out on a good foot when he did establish his practice, because he had the training and kind of mentorship of this super well-respected individual. And I should note that in many cases, Dr. Fanduiz is remembered by Brunswick citizens and praised by Brunswick citizens and very well respected by them. So I would like to think that there's maybe something to the fact that Dr. Mitchell may have played a role in that, just a tiny bit. And I also want to note that Dr. Mitchell was the preceptor for only one other individual in the class of 1892. I don't know what the process was for someone being placed with a preceptor, whether they could request that someone, whether it was random, or if the practicing doctors would choose members of the new class. I don't know, but just again, the fact that he was placed in Dr. Mitchell's care is one to be stressed. So then I have two lovely images I am so excited to share with you of Fanduiz and the class of 1892. So here's the first image. This is, from what I can gather, pretty much the entire class. Not all of them would have graduated necessarily. You could attend the medical school and just participate in the lectures. You didn't necessarily have to write a thesis and go through all the examinations. So maybe not all of them actually got a degree, but they were his classmates in some regard. And here I will zoom in so you get a better view of where Fanduiz is in this photograph. He's pretty much dead center, which is fantastic as well. So that is great. So this image and the one I will show you in just a second are again part of Bowdoin College's Special Collection Archives collection, and they are accessible online. It's how I was able to get them. So again, happy to share how to get those as well. And then we have this second image, which I think is my favorite of the two, of a smaller group of the members of the class of 1892. And you can see Fanduiz there on the very far right. And not quite sure where this photograph was taken. Oh, I had forgot to mention, the previous image was taken right in front of Adams Hall, that building that I mentioned earlier that was built specifically for the medical school. This one, probably somewhere in Brunswick, not sure. Have no idea what the relation of that child on the bicycle is to the group of men, but I think it's great that he's included in the picture. Another thing that's good to note of this image as well, you can kind of see that there is a varying age of individuals that attended the med school. They weren't necessarily, like I said, straight out of undergrad. They could have been either practicing on their own and wanting to kind of up their standards of practice, or second career type individuals. But really just a fantastic image. And I have gone in to Bowdoin's site, and I have identified Fanduiz in those images. So he should be able to be searched by keyword in the future, and those two images should show up, which is fantastic. So as I had mentioned before, anyone who graduated from the medical school was required to write a thesis. And so Fanduiz wrote his thesis on tubercular meningitis. And believe it or not, Bowdoin, as I've mentioned before, the Special Collections and Archives is a fabulous resource, and they keep records on all past students, both at the college and from the medical school. So they actually have his thesis, and you can go in and you can read it, which is exactly what I did in February as I was prepping for what I thought was going to be the first time we were going to do this presentation. So if you're ever in Brunswick, or do live here, you can go in, and as long as you give the Special Collections Library staff a couple days notice, they'll be able to pull this for you. You can actually see his handwriting and the work that he did. So just a brief overview of what he did write on the subject of tubercular meningitis. He broke the thesis down into 4 parts: symptoms, diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment. In the beginning of the thesis, Fanduiz notes that all ages were affected by tubercular meningitis. We now today call this tuberculosis meningitis, but that it seemed to be particularly present in children. Symptoms began with headaches, vomiting, and convulsions, and then could turn into moderate fevers, quick pulses, sensitivity to light and sound. And then later symptoms as the disease progresses could include severe headaches, drowsiness, stiff-necked, a hollowed stomach, and ultimately most patients ended up in a coma and ended up passing away. He does provide some treatments for this disease. They include a cold compress to the head, laxatives, otiform ointment, bromine and iodine of potassium, as well as nourishment that he says is milk and tea, and the good old-fashioned fresh air that is, I feel like, the treatments of most diseases at the very end. I did want to mention just 2 lines towards the end of the thesis that Fanduiz writes, because I think they speak so well to his character and to the compassion that he had as a medical provider. So towards the end, he writes, quote, "With great sorrow, no treatment has been found to stop the progression of the disease. I think that it won't be late before we can accomplish that noble mission." And going further, he says, quote, "The only consolation I have is that I know of many busy brains that are working at that noble end." So he's really confident that he's going to be able to see a treatment for this disease, considering how deadly it is in his lifetime, which is great. Another part of the thesis that he also goes into a little bit of depth is how to identify the disease. And he notes that, of course, you can only get a true diagnosis for tubercular meningitis once a patient has died, and that you can go in and get some tissue samples. But still cool to have his description of how this differed from other types of meningitis that were that medical professionals were aware of at this period. So overall, as someone who is not a scientist and not someone who, knows a ton about science and is a historian, I still found this thesis really easy to get through. It was well balanced. It was straightforward. I, for the most part, could understand everything that he's saying, which I think also speaks so highly to his competence as a medical professional, and for his capability of writing and composing thoughts and medical text in English, which is not his first language. So go on to this next slide, and you can see the entire list of theses that the class of 1892 presented. So you can see the arrow pointing to Fanduiz's for tubercular meningitis. But I wanted to include this because of the very wide range of topics that were presented by his classmates, some of which you get a little bit of a chuckle out of, such as syphilis and marriage. Not quite sure what that might entail, but hey, you could go and read it at Bowdoin. I didn't, but I might have to go back and actually do so. But others that even are more fitting for today, such as the history of epidemic influenza, which is on the front of essentially everyone's mind. So really kind of just getting a gauge and a sense of what his classmates and what his fellow medical professionals are doing. So The newly minted Dr. Fanduiz begins working in Brunswick in the summer of 1892. There is a short blurb in the Brunswick Telegraph, which was the local paper at the time, that was published in July, or on July 14th, 1892. And it reads, Salustiano Fanduiz, MD, has opened an office at the corner of Cedar and Union Streets in the residences of S.F. Purrington, his buddy Samuel Purrington. Dr. Fanduiz graduated this year from the medical school with a most credible standing and by strict attention to his professional hopes to desire a lucrative practice. I tried to figure out what structure this little blurb is referencing, and try to pin down what exact building his practice was in. I haven't had too much hope, and mainly that comes down to the fact that there is no deed during this time period in the 1880s and into the 1890s under Samuel Purrington's name on Cedar Street or Union Street. So not quite sure, maybe they were renting the property. That's very well a possibility, but it doesn't look like they owned the structure that they were in. So not quite sure, and so I can't provide an image of what that building may have looked like. I did find in a town directory about a decade earlier, in 1887, that a Samuel F. Purrington is noted as living on the corner of O'Brien Street and Union Street, which is only a couple blocks down from this said Cedar and Union Street location. O'Brien Street later became Cumberland Street, which is what we know it as today here in Brunswick. As I mentioned earlier, Marguerite, the daughter of Samuel Purrington, she mentions that Fanduiz lived with them while he was a student, but she doesn't have any references to whether or not he practiced there. So I've only got this blurb from the paper, but I'm still going to treat it as pretty factual, even though I can't quite note where exactly the practice was, or at least the building. I also want to say that the Orient, again, that student newspaper from Bowdoin, mentioned that Fanduiz, quote, had a practice larger than many of his fellow townsmen are aware. So it sounds like he had gathered a pretty large following, even early on from his graduation in 1892. Another reference, or another thing that is referenced when talking about Dr. Fanduiz's career in Brunswick, is a note that he provided his medical services to the area's poor and indigent citizens. So this led me to believe that he may have been paid by the town of Brunswick to provide those services to people who were labeled poor, or who were at the almshouse, which was the poor farm / poorhouse in Brunswick. And so PHC, Pajevska History Center, actually has most of the records for the overseers of the poor and the almshouse. So I went on a digging spree to see if I could find anything. And to my happiest surprise, I did in fact find 2 receipts for payment to Dr. Fanduiz. So we can see here that Dr. Fanduiz was paid on November 29th, 1892, $7.50 for attending to the surviving family of Henry L. Metcalf. And then again on December 5th, 1892, a receipt for $150 for medical attention or attendance to George A. Skeetup. So he did in fact provide services, and he was in fact paid by the town of Brunswick for those services. And as the good historian that I think that I am, I made sure to double check these kind of references, because any expense or any payment that is processed for a service or a good that is provided to an individual that is now a kind of a ward of the town and who is identified as poor is reported in the following year's town report. So we can see here in the town report for 1893 that we have Dr. Fanduiz paid twice, again for his medical attention. And if you notice, they match up with the receipts I showed just a second ago. So we have $1.50 for George and $7.50 for Mrs. Henry L. Metcalf. So I love it when the puzzle pieces actually come together and history works out in your favor, and you get a sense that what you're reading is true. In 1893, Dr. Fanduiz also mentored a member of the class of 1894 for the Medical School of Maine while working in Brunswick. So just as Dr. Mitchell had been a mentor for him while he was a student, Fanduiz becomes a mentor of a brand new student, this time an individual named Arthur James Stimpson, who was from Brunswick. So maybe he knew Fanduiz before going to the medical school, maybe not. We probably will never know, but I like to think that maybe they knew each other beforehand. Furthermore, in 1897, Dr. Fanduiz is once again noted in the town report. This time, Dr. Fanduiz is compensated for reporting births and deaths in Brunswick in 1896 to early part of 1897. So like other medical professionals, Dr. Fanduiz was legally allowed to declare an individual dead, and also to make sure that when a child was born, they're alive, they're kicking, great. They are now a new human being. So John Cross has noted that Dr. Fanduiz's signature even ends up on the death certificate of his dear friend, Samuel F. Purrington. So it appears that Fanduiz was attending to Purrington in his final days, and Purrington died in 1897. I have not seen that death certificate. Vital records are still in the hands of the town office in Brunswick. So one day I hope to be able to get my hands on those birth and death certificates just to see what exactly Fanduiz signed off on. But we can see that he was paid $4.50 for that year for creating birth and death records. So in other references to Dr. Fanduiz, they note that he treated patients in Brunswick and Harpswell, which is the town kind of to the east and south of Brunswick, and that's composed of a bunch of islands. Again, particularly aiding the poor in both Brunswick and Harpswell. At PHC, I did find a reference that he treated William Alexander's family in 1896 and a Mrs. Joseph Matthews of Brunswick in 1897, but I have found no documents that show that. I don't know what happened. We don't know what happened to Dr. Fanduiz's receipts or account book that he had for his practice. It is probably long gone at this point, but I'll still keep a part of me, wishing and hoping that it may end up on the doorstep of PHC one day that we can go through it. So, but I also want to mention before we move on to Fanduiz returning to the DR, it wasn't all work for Dr. Fanduiz. He did have some fun while he was here in Maine. And there are two unique stories that John Cross has actually been able to come across in the newspaper that shows that Fanduiz engaged and embraced some of our local pastimes. So in 1898, the local Brunswick paper reports that Fanduiz went on a solo hunting trip in northern Maine, where he ended up with 2 large deer, and apparently he used the crop, the yield that he got from those 2 deer to have venison for some of his patients. So again, always the person thinking of others in that circumstances and providing meat to his patients. And then also the piece that I love the most, he somehow got involved with harness racing and found a great deal of success on the county fair circuit. So I don't know how he got involved with that or what was the motivation, but clearly he was having a pretty good old time and enjoying one of the great parts of Maine summer, which are our fairs. So good to know that he did have a little bit of playtime while he was here, while he was doing all of his very serious work. But as I mentioned in before, Dr. Fanduiz does return to his home country of the Dominican Republic, and that was in 1899. And he returns again during a really important political moment in the DR's history after the assassination of the Dominican Republic's president. And so he settles in the town of Barahona, which again, you can see I've pointed with the red arrow there. So to the west of the capital, Santo Domingo, where he was born. He was really, really excited about the possibilities and the new opportunities that kind of awaited him in the DR, so much so that he bought a salt mine. And was dreaming of the opportunity to apply American technology to mining and logging and agriculture to this area that he had seen and witnessed in the United States. He also continued to practice medicine and became active in the Medical Society of Santo Domingo. He even wrote a letter that was then printed in the Lewiston Journal, a very major and large newspaper here in Maine, around 1900, where he explains that he's back home in the DR, he's still practicing medicine, he's getting involved in politics, and he's just really excited about the new opportunities that this new century is going to provide, and all the work that he thinks he's going to be able to do. But unfortunately, Fanduiz's eagerness and gung-ho nature to participate in local politics soon turned to some major issues. So when he returned home to the DR, people in Brunswick and Bowdoin, lost almost all contact with Fanduiz. They were really fearful that something may have happened to him. They didn't know quite what was going on. So in October of 1899, he actually wrote to the Orient, again, Bowdoin's student paper, and he writes, quote, "It's a very long time since I received a word from you. Probably you wrote and my mail was intercepted by the orders of the president. Well, we have got rid of the old president and the old government. I was a rebel and I raised a rebellion in the East. I got 1,500 men under my immediate command. The entire number mobilized were 10,000 men. Next week we will have an election and I am one of the electors." And he goes further to say, with this incredible amount of optimism, quote, "We will show you a good country. The government is to be democratic. This seems like a dream to me. Think of it. Free speech, free press, and justice." Which is just, you read that and you're like, oh, he had so much faith. He was so excited. He's like, we are going to rise above and we're going to conquer all these issues that we've had as a nation that has been colonized. And it's just, it doesn't go that way. So Fanduiz was a supporter of the wealthy tobacco planter Jimenez, which, again, sorry for my poor Spanish pronunciation as not a native Spanish speaker, but he was elected president in late 1899, and the General Horatio Vasquez was elected the vice president. That relationship went well for a little while, and then it spiraled out of control very, very quickly. And it became a falling out between the president and the vice president, essentially creating two factions within the nation, ones that supported the president and one that supported the vice president. So as I mentioned, Fanduiz supported Jimenez, and as a result of the political upheaval, Fanduiz ends up imprisoned. And so Fanduiz is imprisoned from August of 1901 to December of 1904. We don't really know. There is very little information that we are aware of that discusses his experience in prison and what it was like. But he does note in a future letter that he had essentially escaped to the woods and was hiding in the woods for fear of his life once kind of everything sort of broke down, and that he was captured in the woods and arrested and then imprisoned. People in Brunswick and at Bowdoin were very, very concerned that they had lost contact again with him, and they didn't know what happened. They wanted to know what happened, and it wouldn't be until he's released that they get word from him again. I do also want to note, and I know it's kind of not part of this, but when Fanduiz does return to the DR, he does get married, and he has 4 children. He has 3 daughters and a son, and of course we know that he obviously had to have had some children because we have his descendants, or a few of them, here with us tonight, which is fantastic. So, okay, he's been imprisoned. Life is not good, but in 1904. Finally, there is word from Fanduiz. So Fanduiz sends a letter to his friend Byron Stevens, who you can see pictured here on the slide. Byron Stevens was a very well-known individual, again, in the town of Brunswick. He operated the college bookstore, so he also had a very large tie to the college, and he appears to have been a really close friend to Fanduiz as well. So much so, it's one of my favorite parts of the Fanduiz story, he sent a live parrot to the Stevens family from the DR for them to have. I don't know what happened to the status of the parrot. Obviously it must have arrived live because the Stevens family had it, but I just think that that's great, that was something that he needed to send to his friends in Maine, where obviously we have no parrots. So in this 1904 letter to Fanduiz, or to Stevens, Fanduiz notes that he had been imprisoned, but a little bit of his optimism is back, because he talks to Byron and says that he wants to teach the locals how to actually hold an election based on American practices and principles that he had witnessed here. So even though he had become a political prisoner and he had gone through all of this stuff, he was still optimistic that he was going to be able to help change his country for the better, which again is just incredibly admirable. But the news of this letter to Stevens was such a big deal that the existence of the letter actually ended up being the subject of an article in the Lewiston Journal, again, one of the newspapers I referenced earlier. So it was like thought to be dead, but of course he's alive, and it was massive news for the nation. So then, a few years later, in 1916, Fanduiz moves to San Pedro de Marquis and began working with the U.S. military on a number of public health initiatives. Again, the politics of this period are a little bit confusing and very, very messy, but what essentially you need to know is that the U.S. government had begun controlling areas of the DR around this 19-teens period in a move to control the customs revenue for the DR. The country was in a lot of foreign debt, and the U.S. Stepped in as a means to try and control that. But while he was in San Pedro de Marquis, he begins working as the medical examiner of the port. It's a very large port city. Again, why the U.S. government is there are exports and imports. But one of the things that Fanduiz undertakes is a campaign to eradicate malaria in the area. And he supervised the removal or covering of small bodies of water where mosquitoes could lay their eggs. Of course, we know stagnant areas of water are not good for mosquito populations because they can thrive there, they can lay their eggs, and then, of course, we can have, higher levels of the mosquitoes that can carry the malaria virus. He even took it a step further, and he actually enlisted the support and resources of the U.S. military, who he was working with, to drain a nearby swamp. close to the port. And these measures are very well known to the DR for greatly reducing the numbers and positive cases of malaria that they see in this one particular area. So much so that it garners the attention of some of the medical professionals here in the States as well. And so the American Medical Association of Clinical Research gave him a diploma for his research on malaria prevention. So he was well regarded for the steps that he was taking to help the public health of his area. And then something that strikes very close to home right about now, Dr. Fanduiz was also on the front lines of protecting San Pedro de Marquis during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. So much so that I found an article in Spanish just the other day that I got all translated for me, that he stationed health inspectors on the outskirts of the city, essentially creating this border to prevent visitors from coming into the city that may have symptoms or may have been exposed to the Spanish flu. And again, he is credited for saving a ton of lives and for having a significant fewer deaths in this port city than other areas and of similar population size in the DR during this time. So as I read that, I kind of had like an aha moment, because the parallels are just incredible to think that he essentially was creating a quarantine in this city to help protect his citizens, which is not unlike essentially what we're doing around the nation today, which is great as well. Again, it wasn't all fun and games, or all work, I should say, for Fanduiz. While he is in this port city, he is visited by his longtime friends, the Purringtons. So Marguerite, who I mentioned earlier, her brother Harry, and their mother Lizzie actually come and visit Fanduiz in 1920. And it's noted in a couple places that they actually came down, one, to visit, but also to get some medical attention from Fanduiz. So he was still providing services to his longtime friends many years after he had left Brunswick and Maine. But just before Fanduiz began working in San Pedro de Marquis, he actually reconnected with the Medical School of Maine and Bowdoin College. In 1912, Fanduiz gave a $50 donation to Bowdoin to help establish the endowment for the Edward Mason Dispensary, which you can see here in this top image. The Edward Mason Dispensary was located at 65 India Street in Portland. So Portland being Maine's largest city, and about, well, in today's travel terms, about a half hour south of Brunswick. But it was established as a practicing clinic for Medical School of Maine students. Prior to this, there was no place that a Bowdoin student, or that a collective place that the medical school students could go and receive clinical training and provide their services and a learning environment, not much unlike residents do today in hospitals. And so the land and funds for constructing and equipping this dispensary were a gift to Bowdoin from Mr. and Mrs. Hugh J. Chisholm, who were the daughter and son-in-law of Dr. Edward Mason, who this is named after. And that was established in 1911. So the medical school doesn't end up using this structure and this clinic for very long, because the medical school does go out of business, per se. In the early 1920s, when many other like country medical schools, as they were referred to, were shut down for inadequate practices and inadequate training. But it did end up back in the hands of the city of Portland, and it remained a clinic and a place for public health research and treatment for a number of years after the fact. So then later on in life, In 1925, Dr. Fanduiz moved to San Francisco de Marquise, which you can see there with the red pointed arrow again. He moves there to start working in a hospital. And then in 1938, Fanduiz moves to Monte Cristi, to become a doctor at an institution there. About a year later, in 1939, he moves once more, and for the last time, to San Cristobal, where he worked as a volunteer at the Juan Pablo Pina Hospital all the way up until his death in 1941. So thought it was fun to show you the map and see where he ended up all around the DR, because he kind of made a big giant circle, ending up very close to home there at the end. But it's noted by, again, his close friend Marguerite, that Fanduiz suffered from stomach and bladder issues later in his life, and was likely the cause of his declining health and ultimately his death. And it is also Marguerite who informs Bowdoin that Dr. Fanduiz had passed away. She had kept up correspondence with his children, and thought it was important that Bowdoin know that this distinguished individual had finally passed away. So in a letter she writes to the college, she notes that, quote, "Fanduiz loved Maine, and especially Brunswick, and it was always his great desire to be able to return." And she then goes on further, really asking and more or less demanding that the college send condolences to Dr. Fanduiz's family, saying, quote, "You have no idea what it would mean to them, for they were always so proud of their father because he was a graduate of Bowdoin Medical School." And so I think, again, that speaks highly to the individual that Fanduiz was, and the really care and compassion that his dear friend for many, many years had for him, and wanting the college to acknowledge what an incredible individual Dr. Fanduiz was. And so finally, my favorite image that we have in the collection of Dr. Fanduiz here at PHC, this one I thought I'd end you with, and also with a quote that I found that I think sums everything up just so perfectly. The quote is from Dr. Francisco Mosco Puella, who was a distinguished physician, surgeon, and director of many DR hospitals. And he called Dr. Fanduiz, quote, "the best example the country has had of a tenacious, virtuous, hardworking, patriotic, and visionary man." And like I said, I don't think there's a better way to truly sum up the incredible life that Dr. Fanduiz led, both here in Maine and in his home country of the DR, than that statement from a fellow countryman and a fellow doctor. So it has been a real honor to be able to learn and get very intimate with Dr. Fanduiz and his life. And really, this is only the start of his really remarkable story, and everything that he was able to accomplish in his life. So that's about it for me. I am happy to take some questions, comments, or any kind of ideas people might have. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, if I can remember how to do that exactly.
Catherine, I'll invite folks to, again, use the chat box if you want, or raise a hand to make a comment. I do want to, something that struck me when Catherine first showed it to me was the photos, the two photos of him kind of in the middle of the presentation there, and maybe at some point we could go back and look at them, but I was really, really in particular struck by that first photo.
I'll bring those back up. Just give me a second.
Because of, one, the look on his face in the center of the graduating class there, And the way that he's in profile, he's turned toward the side, and then there is a man standing behind him. There
we go.
Yeah, and if we go to that next one, there's a man standing behind him with his hand on his shoulder. Doctor, not yet doctor, but soon to be Dr. Fanduiz is not particularly happy looking, and of course surrounded by all of these white men. It just, boy, the look on his face really struck me when I saw that.
It's a very striking image. That's exactly the thing that I was drawn to that image too. Once I was like, oh, okay, there he is. And then to really kind of take in his posture, his positioning, and his facial expression. But it is great.
Yeah.
And here I can go.
So, I mean, one of my questions is just how he did get along, with the general population in Maine at the time, and what that experience might have been like, which is something that probably isn't anywhere to be researched per se.
Yeah,
but that picture really hit it home for me.
Yeah, I haven't been able to find, and from what I can gather, neither has John Cross, about any kind of anecdotal information or kind of references to his relationship with his classmates, and furthermore his relationship with his patients, the town of Brunswick. But clearly he was pretty well known. I mean, the fact that his existence and his release from prison is blasted in the news and is subject to a lot of people's interests show that obviously they knew who he was, they respected him, and they did, at least to some degree, care for him and care for his well-being. So I think we can generally get a sense that he was pretty well respected and pretty well thought of in Brunswick and by the community. So here I can do the other image just again so we can get a great look at that other photo, because it is great as well.
Yeah, and what strikes me about that one too is that he's off to the side and has a very sober look on his face. Many of the men in that photo do, but he's sort of separated from the group a little bit. At any rate, we want to give other folks a chance, and I would love to give people Dr. Fanduiz's descendants an opportunity to say something if they would like to. So please feel free to raise a hand and unmute yourself and ask a question or make a comment.
So it looks like we got one in the chat box from John. Thanks for that, John. John writes, perhaps I missed it, but had he expressed a particular interest in medicine when he met his friend from Maine? As far as I know, no. I think it was more of, oh, this is an opportunity for me to go to Maine, this place that I have dreamed of, and also, perhaps gain a new career, gain some new skills, progress myself. I think that was more of it, but I haven't found any reference necessarily saying that he wanted to be a doctor or desired to be that. But turns out he's probably pretty darn good one. So.
I think we have a raised hand here from the senior Angela.
Yes.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, first of all, I really was impressed with this meeting. I've had the opportunity to speak with Catherine before, and she brought about so much knowledge that I myself and my family did not know even existed. As she herself said, when we reached out to her, we were not sure what was to be found there. And she did all this research, and I know the school and everyone else involved has preserved so much, and we are so thankful to have this, because, we didn't even know it existed, let alone know that it would be exposed and in such a platform as this. at a time like this, when these types of doctors now are being applauded worldwide for the things that they're doing. And back then, what I can say about him, I'm one of his last descendants. I'm I am the daughter of his son. He only had one son. He was married twice. First marriage with two daughters. Second marriage was a daughter and a son. I am the child of the son, the only child of that son. We were all a very small family. And then then I have three children. And the other daughter, his other daughter of that latter marriage, is deceased. She died at an early age, and there are only two children left from her. So basically, there's only like 5 or 6 of us in total of his descendants. What I know of because he was much older than my grandmother, his last wife. So when I was born, he had already passed long ago. So I never had the chance to meet him, neither did my other cousin that I speak of, and neither did our children, let's say, because he was much, much older than the grandmother. So what we have are also stories of him, things we heard, but he had been gone so long that, but what I do know, one of the stories that I always remember my grandmother saying is that she would have been a very rich and powerful woman had he not been so generous and so merciful. She always commented that, and jokingly, she said that he gave his heart to his patients. Everything was practically free, including the medication that he would give them. In one of the towns, San Pedro de Macorís, they have a statue in his honor. So you can imagine how much he was loved and known there. One of our oldest merengue, which is the Dominican Maine music, one of the oldest merengue speaks of him, and I believe I will share that with the college and with Catherine and with you. And so
Yes, please
as
do.
a part, yes, anything from now on. And I too have continued to try and research and find things that I definitely plan to share. But again, we are so thankful. And to everyone that's also, joining us in this platform, because you've brought history to us that would have never been known to us. A lot of the things you've said, including the things that happened in the Dominican Republic, were not known specifically to us. We were too young, and too far gone, let's say, to have known so much. It was probably shared mostly with his other children and with the other older family members. But thank you. That's all we can really say. Thanks again, and especially to you for sharing. And I know we've had communications. And definitely I will try and continue to feed as much from the Dominican Republic, any research I get from there, and we can do. Angela, also my daughter, has really been, one of the greater parts of making me reach out to the college also. So I want to thank her too, because she really followed through in getting her great-grandfather's story out there. Thank you.
Boy, that was just fantastic. And I want to say this is why we do what we do. So
Exactly.
that's really wonderful. And I appreciate you sharing all that with us. And it's great that we were able to provide you with the information. Sometimes many times we have people contact us and we can't give them what they are really looking for because it doesn't exist, at least not in our collection. But when we can, we can make these things happen, it's really a gift. So thank you for joining us tonight and sharing all of that. It's really meaningful. Would somebody else like to ask a question or make a comment? I know we're at about 6:22 here. Marie would like to say something. You have to unmute yourself, Marie. Yeah.
First of all, I think I expressed the opinion of the group that you did a phenomenal job, Catherine. And I think all of us really appreciate the effort that you really put into this. But I couldn't help noticing that when he made the donation towards the clinic in Portland, I couldn't help noticing the name directly underneath that. Our dear Frank. And so my question is, in your research, was there or are there any connections between the two, since both were actively practicing at the time, and Frank was a graduate of the Bowdoin Medical School?
I haven't found any connection that brings the two of them together, but for those of you who don't know, where I talked about the dispensary, the Edward Mason dispensary in Portland, and showed Fanduiz's donation, the line underneath that noted a donation from F.N. Whittier. And so one of the two historic properties that we have in our holdings at PHC is the Schofield Whittier House, which is actually attached to our office, which is this fantastic house full of so much history. And one of its occupants was Dr. Frank Nathaniel Whittier. And so Frank was a graduate both of Bowdoin's undergraduate program and then also from the Medical School of Maine. And he actually would have been teaching at the Medical School of Maine when Fanduiz is there in the 1890s. Essentially, Frank kind of has a very quick turnaround and he graduates and he's automatically put on the faculty there and doing a bunch of other things for Bowdoin that we don't have to go into right now. So it very well could be that Fanduiz had a lecture or took a lecture that Frank would have given. It's hard to believe that they wouldn't have had some sort of interaction at some point in the number of years that Fanduiz not only is studying but also is practicing in Brunswick. So no connection point or no document that physically puts them together, but it's not too far of a stretch to imagine that they would have known each other. But great question for sure.
Larissa, I'd like to make one other note. My son here, as I said, is one of the last descendants, and as a family, we believe that he has a great resemblance to Fanduiz. I want to put him on camera for everyone to see him. This is Michael Anthony Tiziano.
Fantastic.
Hello.
I think you should take that wonderful final great photo of him with the cane where he's standing there. Right? You could reenact it. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
You see the resemblance?
I do. Yes.
Yeah. Yes,
fantastic.
He is the only one that we've really seen that.
Everyone says that.
Resemblance. Yes. When Angela, who found the pictures of the college and that, when we saw that, we were amazed at the resemblance.
Isn't that great?
Yeah.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
I know that Jeanne d'Arc had her hand up. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment.
I was just wondering, I think that the Frank Whittier that you addressed is also the person for whom Whittier Field is named, and it's the big athletic part of the athletic complex at the college.
Yes. So yeah, one of the other responsibilities that Frank had at Bowdoin was he was essentially the college's first athletic director. He didn't quite have that title. He was the director of the Sargent Gymnasium, but essentially was the the athletic director, or what would be considered an athletic director. He is also the person to thank for the polar bear as Bowdoin's mascot.
Yes.
He is the person who convinces the alumni council to be able to pick the polar bear, because prior to that, Bowdoin did not have a mascot. So I always like to, when I have any sort of Bowdoin talk or something, I always dress in my Bowdoin colors. That's why I chose the white, black and white shirt today, because I'm a proud alumna of Bowdoin and always sporting, Bowdoin pride. So
I was going to comment on your very attractive outfit and wondered if you didn't specifically do that. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Good thinking.
Muted. Another comment or question? Okay. I think probably we will wind this down. And again, I want to thank, Catherine has always from day one impressed me when I arrived in 2015 as director and met her. She was, well, you were in England at the time.
that's right. Yes, I was abroad when you came in.
Met you when you came back, but is very impressive and will go on to do great things in graduate school and beyond. We will miss her very much. She's, as you can tell, an excellent historian and researcher, and just a great all-around individual. So I thank her for that. I really when I saw that Angela were joining us on Facebook, I was so excited. And obviously these additional family members that are there in the background, we were really, really appreciative of you being with us. That just brings this program to a whole other level for sure. So thank you so much for joining us, and for everybody else who's joined us tonight. And again, we'll be back in June with a great segue. Dr. Fanduiz's work on the flu pandemic is a great segue. As you can see, Pam is putting her thumb up there. To her program in June, so we'll look forward to that, and other online events, and hopefully it won't be too long before we can have in-person events again. We'll keep you posted on that. But thank you so much again for joining us. Have a great evening. Here's to the summer.
Larissa, I put my information out a few months ago on a web page that says that if anybody wanted to contact me. I don't know if it's still there, but I'd like to express to anyone that is joining in, or anyone that comes or needs any information from me, I'm very available, and I would really enjoy speaking to anyone. So my information will be, can be given out to anyone if you need to, and I will pass it back on to Catherine so that, it's available. Okay. And
wonderful.
And thank you all so very much.
Thank you so much.
My family, Miguel.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care.
You did an amazing job, Catherine.
Thank
Better
you.
than finding your roots.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody, and
Lovely program. Thank you for doing it. Wonderful.
Welcome.
happy
Thank you.
summer.
Thanks, Catherine. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night.
So you can probably stop recording at this point.
Good point.